In this demo, we'll demonstrate how to use the grid component from the SavvyUI library. The grid component can be used in a paged mode where you provide a pager, and the grid will basically query your component, the parent of the grid, to provide the data on a page-by-page basis. Or you could use it as a in-memory data grid where you provide the entire data set and the grid manages the data. In this case, in this specific tutorial, we're going to start with the in-memory grid, and then the next tutorial will discuss how the actual pager works. So to start, we're going to create two files to contain that grid implementation, and then we're going to show how to use that and show all the different APIs that you could use to manipulate the grid, provide the data, add rows, delete rows, get data from the grid, and set data in the grid. So we'll go through all those functions. But for now, the first step, we're going to create the files. So we're going to go ahead and add a new item to the project. And this will be, we're going to call it the grid demo. Let's call it memory grid demo. And we'll also add a header. And now we'll start declaring the class for the header. And create a constructor, the destructor. And we'll also implement a function of the component, which is window created. This function will be called when the component has been created. So we could, which is the panel, basically the parent. The panel is going to be the parent of the grid. So when this function gets called, we're going to construct the grid. We could do it in the constructor, but it's better to do it in this function in case there's a dependency on the component being created already, the parent. So let's do it in this function instead. And we're going to declare an instance of the grid. And we want this panel to implement certain functions like action listener and stuff like that, because what I'm planning on doing in this demo is actually having a panel that contains a grid, and then it has buttons to add, delete, edit, and delete records, in addition to some other stuff. But for now, the first thing we're going to implement is the action listener, which will allow, when we add the buttons, we actually need to listen to action events on those buttons so we could actually react on them. And this is what we have to do is actually, if you go to the definition of this, you'll see that there's a function, abstract function that we have to implement, which is called onAction. So we're just going to include that here. And then we'll implement it in the CPP file. So in addition to the grid, like I mentioned, we're going to have buttons like add button, edit button, delete button, and we'll include the button class in here. Okay, now we'll go ahead and implement these functions. So in the CPP file, we're just going to include the header. Then we'll paste these functions. This is the destructor, the window created function that we're overriding. And so in the window constructed function, window created function, this is where we're going to create the layout of the panel and set up the grid and the buttons and all that stuff. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we have to do is just set the layout. And we're going to pass it. So we're going to have a grid occupying the full width of the screen, and below that we're going to have a maybe 10 pixel space, and then we're going to have a row for the buttons. So and for the columns wise, we're going to have 3 buttons on the left side of the grid, but below the grid, and then that's it, and then the whole grid. So this is how we divide the columns. So we're going to have basically 4 columns. 100 pixels for each of the buttons, which is 100, 100, 100, and then the remaining space will be for the grid. So the grid will occupy all 4 columns, and each of the buttons will occupy 100 pixels. So to do that, we just basically specify 3 columns of fixed width, which is 100, and then 1 column of fill column, which is -1, and that will be for the remaining space in the panel. And now the rows, we're just going to need a fill row, which is going to be for the grid. The grid's going to occupy whatever remaining space there is. There will be a 10 pixel space between the grid and the buttons, and then we're going to have a 35 pixels for the buttons. Now that we had this, the reason why we haven't, in order to obviously make this a panel, we have to inherit the grid panel. So I'm going to go to the header and tell it to inherit this grid panel, and to do that we need to include the grid panel header. And now this should resolve the error with the set layout. We did. Okay, so now we'll start laying out the components. So to do that, we just call add component on the panel, and we pass it the first component, which is grid. And what we said we wanted to do, we're going to start at column 0, row 0, and we want it to span 4 columns. So we're just going to have 4 right there. And then we'll have another one for the buttons. And this is the add button. And now this is going to be at column 0, but row 2, which is 0, 1, 2. And now we'll copy that one. And 1 will be for the edit button, and 1 for the delete. And this will be at column 1, and this will be at column 2. And we're going to initialize the buttons, and the add button is going to have a text of add. So we're going to just call set text on that one. And this will be add. Now we'll do the same thing for the add button, edit button, and then one for the delete. And in addition, we need to register a listener on each of these buttons to tell it that we're going to be listening to actions whenever any of these buttons get clicked. We want this panel or the parent of these buttons to receive the event. So we call add action listener. And since this class is already implementing the action listener, we could just pass ourselves or the panel as the parent, as the listener to these events. And now if we run, nothing's going to happen because we're not showing this, so we're not making use of this memory grid panel demo yet, panel. So we'll just go to our demo right here, and we're going to add another option to the menu, to the button menu, so we could actually view it. So we'll do a grid demo, or we'll call it grid memory, and we'll show it on the right side inside the card panel. So we'll name it exactly the same way. And we'll call the object grid memory demo. And now we just have to declare this here. So it's going to be memory grid demo. We'll include the file, header file. And now the last thing we have to do is just add one of these statements in the selection, the button menu. Whenever an item is selected, you will receive an event for that specific item that was clicked. So we just have to add another else if for that. And we have to look, we're looking for the word or the text to grid memory. When we get that, we're just going to show that card or panel that contains the grid in the card on the right side, and we do that by calling card panel.set visible card. Since selection value is going to be grid memory, if we go up here to the card panel, grid memory, when we show that card, it's going to show our grid memory demo. So let's run the application and take a look at the results of this. So here's our grid memory item. When we click on it, that's what it shows. So if you notice, we have a grid and we have 3 buttons below it. When we click on these now, even though we added the action listener, we're not doing anything. We're not responding to those events. So first, we're going to set up the columns as a first step for the grid. And then we're going to handle these different events to be able to add records and all that stuff. So going to in a previous tutorial, we created a dialog box called employee details dialog. So I'm going to go to the header of this one. I'm going to be using this employee details dialog to prompt the user for information whenever they need to add a record or edit a record. So I'm going to create a grid that displays the information that's currently available in this pop-up, so the information matches. And that will be the first name, last name, address line 1, address line 2, telephone, email, and all that stuff. So I'm going to take these values and go to the memory grid. So we're going to set up now the grid columns. And to set up the grid columns, we just call add column on the grid. So we say add column. And we'll just give the column a name, which is going to be first name, let's say. And then the column title is going to be first name, a more readable version. And we're going to set the visible state to true. We want this column to be visible in the grid. So you could actually add columns that are visible and columns that are not visible. We're going to add all the columns, all the fields that we have here to the grid, but we're not going to show all of them. So some of them we're going to make them invisible. And then for the first column, let's say we want it to be 2 spaces. So we're going to divide the grid into a certain number of columns in our head, and then we're going to allocate those columns depending on the column, what the column requires. So first name and last name will probably be the same. Address will be probably time and a half that. Telephone number will be probably half the width of a first name, and so on. We're probably not going to display the email and the note. We'll just add them to the grid, but keep them hidden. So we'll add now the last name. We'll show the address. We're going to just show address, one address. So we're going to, or we'll do address line 1. We're just going to show the first address, not the second line. And this one, we're going to allocate 3 for it. And we're going to add the telephone. And this, so we're going to allocate for this 1 space, just like in 1 column. And then the rest of them, I like to place all my visible components, visible columns at the top. And now we're going to add the invisible ones. So we're going to make a note here that these are hidden columns. And this will be address line 2. Since these are hidden, we need to set this flag to false. And it doesn't matter what size we allocate because they're not visible, so it doesn't matter. And then 1 for the email. and one for the note. And I'm going to add an ID because eventually we're going to actually hook up this dialog, this grid to the database. So we're going to create a table that has an ID that's auto-generated. So we want to actually store that in the grid without displaying it. This will be the record ID so that we can update the record in the database when the user edits the grid. So now that we have this, if we run again, we click on this, now we see that we have the columns and all that. So now we're going to handle the events from the buttons. So we're going to say if ev.sourceComponentID. So when the add button is clicked, we're going to receive the ID of the add button. So we're going to compare that to find out which button was clicked. We're going to compare it to the ID of the button. So we're going to say get ID. So if it's the add button that was clicked, we're going to do something. Else if the edit button is clicked, we're going to do something else. And if the delete button is clicked, we'll delete the record. So to add to the grid, we're going to display a dialog that captures the information from the user. So how do we do that? I mentioned that we created the dialog box in the previous tutorial, so we're going to use that. And how do we use that? In our demo, I have an example of how we use that, so we're just going to copy it from there. We're going to go back to this, and we're going to display the dialog. And here we're going to add the same things as we're going to be using similar code. For now, I'll comment this out. And employee dialog, we need to include the header. So we don't need to initialize anything in the dialogs because this is a new record. And when we add, we're going to prompt the user for the information. And when when the user clicks OK, then we're going to add a record to the grid. We're not going to add to the database yet because we haven't created the database. So to add it to the grid, we'll do this. We'll say, basically, we're going to call a grid.addRow. And that returns the row index, which is int 64. So we just need to check to make sure that the row index, the grid actually added the row, and we check by checking against 0. So if it's greater than or equal to 0, that means the row has been added. If it's -1, that means there was some kind of failure. So once we have the row index, now we could call the set cell value on the grid. Set cell value. And this one, we pass it the row index. We're telling it which row we want to set the cell values on. And this one, you provide the column name, which in this case is going to be first name. These are the exact, these have to match the names that were added as columns right here. So the first parameter of add column has to match with these values. So when you say, I want to set the value of column first name, at row whatever, you need to make sure that the name is spelled correctly and matches the one in the add column. And the last parameter would be the value and this we capture from the dialog. So the dialog box actually has public data. So if you look at the actual dialog, when the user clicks OK, these will be populated with the data from the fields that we're capturing the data. So we are sure that we're going to get the values from these fields. And now we'll do the same thing for the rest of the columns. And this one will be last name. This will be address line 1. Address line 2. This will be the telephone. And then we'll have the email address. And then finally the note. And that should be it. So as we do this, let's try this. Let's try adding a row, right? So when we click on the grid memory, click add. Now we get the dialog box to do that. So we're gonna say John Doe 123 Main Street, say Miami, Florida 33145. Let's say we have and then jdoe at whatever aol.com. And when we click OK, notice that we actually have a record right now. If we add another record, Jane Doe 123 Main Street, Miami, Florida 33145. And I'm not going to add a telephone for that one. So now we have two records. The next thing now, when we actually close the application, these are going to disappear because we're not saving them in a database, or we're not retrieving them from the database. So we're going to have to re-add the records to implement to show the edit, but that's okay. So we're going to go now and implement the edit functionality. The only difference between the edit and the delete, I mean the edit and add, is that we're going to be loading existing information into the dialog. And to do that, the first thing we need to check is if there is a record selected in the grid. And how we do that, we're going to call a function in the grid. That function is called getSelectedRow. GetSelectedRow. And this returns basically the position of the record that's selected. If there is one, this should be in 64. And now we check to see if it's greater than or equal to 0. So if it's greater than or equal to 0, that means we proceed with the editing of the information. So we're going to do this. Else, we're going to display an error message. We're going to say dialog factory show warning. We'll pass this as the parent to the dialog. And then we're going to say no record selected. The user has to select a record, obviously, in order to edit that. So we'll just include that header file for the dialog factory. And let's try it without selecting a record first. And then we'll come back here and get the data from the grid for that row that was selected, populate the dialog with it, and then the rest of the code should basically work as is, except for the add, because instead of adding a new record, like we did in the add, we're actually going to just use the row index from this and set the values. So we're just going to have to remove this add value, add row. So now that we have this, I'm going to add a record. And then I don't have a record selected, even though there is a record, but it's not selected. So if I click on edit now, I should get that error saying no record selected. And there it is. So if I do click on that and edit, now it's going to display the dialog, but I don't want that code to actually work the way it is. I need to modify it a little bit. So I'm going to close this one again. And instead of calling set cell value, I'm going to copy these statements. And right here, before we show the dialog, we have to declare the dialog, obviously, in order to set the values in the dialog. So what we're going to say is dialog dot first name equals, instead of set, I mean, we're going to get. And we're just going to remove the last parameter right there. And same thing for this one. We're just going to take this, set it to that, and just change it to get. So let's change all of them to get right now. And finally the note. And now we don't need to add a row because we already have a row. We're just retrieving its values and we're going to override its values. So we're going to remove this. And we know the row index is already greater than or equal 0 because we check right here. So this is the code that we need. So now if I go back and we add a new row, John Doe, first we're just going to add the first and last name. And now when I edit this, the first and last name should be populated in the dialog. As you can see, they are. So I'm going to do 123 Main Street, Miami. I'm going to spell the full name of the state so we could go back and edit that to see and just type some bogus zip code. And when I click OK, now it's updated. So if I click edit again, I want to make a correction. I just do this 33145, and then just in case this is somebody's phone number, I'm just going to put zeros, and then that's it. So I'm going to click OK. Now I have that. Now, in order to edit a record right now, you actually have to click select the row and edit. But what if you want to actually double click on the row? We're not handling that right now. So there is an event that you could listen to on the grid to capture double clicks, and we're going to actually do that. So to do that, we're going to go, and it's going to contain the same logic as this one. So now we're going to basically move this code to a separate function and then call it from both places when the user clicks the edit button or when the user when we have the double click event happening. So first we're going to add a double click item listener. So to do that, we just say add item double click listener, and we're going to add this. So we have to implement row double click listener. So we'll go up to the header. And to see what function needs to be implemented, we go to the declaration, and you have to actually implement this function. We're just going to copy it and then add it there so we can implement it. And then go to the memory grid and add a function. We're just going to insert it here. And if you type ev dot, you'll see what you're getting. You're getting the row index and the source component. In this case, the source component ID is going to be the grid ID because we only have one grid that we're listening to, so we're only going to receive events from that grid. So we're not going to even worry about that. If we had multiple grids being displayed on in the same panel, then we're going to check if the source ID equals grid or another grid or something like that, because our action or our reaction to that event is going to be different, obviously, for different grids. And so now we're going to use row index to determine what row was clicked. And we're going to say if this is greater than or equal to 0, which will always be. We don't even need to check for that because we know the grid is not going to call our function unless a real row has been double clicked. So I'm going to do this and I'm going to say edit row, which is a function that we're going to create. And so edit row is going to receive the row index and it's going to basically contain this code from the edit, and then we'll call edit row from here too. So let's actually create that function. And this will receive the row index. Now this whole logic is going to be copied and used. And we just need to declare this in the header. It's a new function. So we're going to make this private. By default, usually anything that's not, you don't specify public or whatever is private, but I like to separate the functions from the variables. So now that we have that, and the logic, the same logic is gonna stick the way it is, and we're just gonna take this edit row call and just replace all the code inside this handler for the event. So we're still gonna get the selected row here, and we're gonna check if it's greater than or equal to 0, and then we're gonna pass that row index. The same thing we did with the double click, but here we're no longer calling get selected row on the grid. We're just getting that from as a parameter. So now let's try that and see what happens. We click on that, add John Doe. And now if I select that and click edit, it does that. Now if I go and double click on the row, the same thing. So now we're getting the event, and now we're able to do that, and I could change whatever I want. Let's say I wanted to add Miami Street and click OK, and that got updated. So the only remaining thing we have to do is we're not going to go into paging because that's going to be the next tutorial. This one was just to handle data in memory. So we're going to click delete. And when we click it right now, nothing's going to happen. So what the delete is going to do is when you click it, it's going to get the selected row. If there's a selected row, it will delete it. It will prompt the user to confirm, and then it will delete it. So let's do that. So we're going to copy this code right here into the delete condition. And we're going to get the selected row. If the selected row if there is a selected row, we're going to use it. We're going to confirm with the user whether we can delete the row, or we're going to say no record selected. So we're going to remove this, and we're going to confirm with the user whether they're sure that they want to actually delete the record. So we're going to say dialog factory dot show confirm. These are all static functions, so you could just call them. We're going to pass this as the parent, and we're going to say, are you sure you want to delete the selected record? And then in the title, we want to say confirm delete. And this function will return true or false. If the user clicks yes, it will return true. So at this point, we delete it. So now that we have the row index, we can just delete it from the grid by saying grid, calling grid dot delete row, and we pass it the row index. So let's try that. We're going to add a row. And if we click delete now, it's going to say no record selected, right? Just like the edit. So now if we click on that and now we do delete, now we're getting this confirmation. Notice that it has a title and it says, are you sure you want to delete the selected record? If I say no, nothing's going to happen. But if I do say yes, it will be removed. And that's it. That concludes this tutorial. I look forward to making another video for the grid. It's going to look exactly the same, and it's going to have the same type of information, but in the other one, we're going to create a database, and we're going to keep adding records, and we're going to support paging. That means we're going to basically set a pager on the grid, and the pager will call our component to get the data for each page. We're not going to load the entire data set into memory, because if you have thousands or millions of records, that's a lot of memory to occupy. So we'll be waiting for the grid every time the user pages to call our function to get the rows for that specific page that the grid needs to display. But that's for another tutorial. Thank you so much for your patience. I look forward to making the next video.